Hey guys, real quick, we're going to talk about the difference between relative and absolute maximum and minimums, okay? So you have maximums and you have minimums. Okay, we can all imagine what a maximum is. It's kind of like the highest point on something. A minimum would be the lowest point on something. Here we can see, oh, that's probably a minimum. And that's probably a minimum. Maximums, oh, there's a maximum. Hey, here's a maximum. So we've got a couple maximums, minimums. Okay. Max. Max. No, Max is not your boyfriend Max that we're talking about. It's the maximum. Okay. I know you got excited. All right, and minimums. So now we need to talk about the difference of absolute and relative. Okay, we have absolute maximums, minimums. We have relative maximum, minimums. I'm going to move this back just a little bit more. There you go. So I can stand off to the side of it. All right, so with an absolute maximum, we are saying it is hands down the highest point on the interval. So hands down, what is the absolute highest point on the interval? Is this the highest point or is this the highest point? This one is. This one is the absolute maximum point on the interval. Do we have an absolute minimum? We do. Over here we have an absolute minimum. Okay? How about relative? When we're talking about relative maximum and minimums, we're talking about a limit, okay? So if we're just looking at a small area, for instance, here to there, is there a relative minimum? Yeah, relatively minimum right there. But also, right here, it's not the absolute minimum, but on this small interval, is it the lowest point? If you think of it as rainwater, would water collect right there? Absolutely. So this is the relative minimum. Up here, is this the highest spot on a hill? I'm not asking is it the highest spot on Earth. Is it just the highest spot on the hill? Yeah. So this would be a relative maximum. Okay? Relative minimum, relative maximum, absolute, absolute. Well, let's look at this graph now. Let's name and label the absolute minimums, maximums, relative minimums, relative maximums. Let's start with the relative minimums and maximums. So we'll start with relatives. Right here, this point, this is the first one that kind of pops out. Is it the highest point on the graph? No, it's not the highest point. But it is a high point. Okay, it is a hill. There's higher spots here. I mean, that spot over there, it's probably a little bit lower, but it could be higher. This is a relative maximum. Which kind of brings me to this point over here. This point, again, it's not the highest point on the graph. It's high. It's the highest point around it. So we would call this a relative maximum as well. Okay. Let's talk about relative minimums. Relative minimum would be any spot that collects water. So we've got a relative minimum right about there. Water would collect. Water would also collect right here. Are either of those points an absolute minimum? Yeah, this point right here is the lowest point on the entire graph. That would be an absolute minimum. Over here, this would be a relative. Okay, that'd be a relative minimum. Now I'm going to think, where would the absolute maximum, what's the absolute maximum value on this graph? What is the absolute highest value? Well, if we're looking at the graph, there's a little arrow, so it keeps going up and up and up and up. Is there an actual value that we ever get to? There's not. So since there's not an actual maximum value, there is no absolute maximum, because infinity isn't absolute. If you say that, 499,000 is the highest you get to, it's not the highest you get to. You can get higher and higher and higher. So there's no absolute number, okay? It's limitless. So this one just has relative maximums, no absolute maximums. All right, it's your turn. I want you to take a look at this graph. Where are your relative and absolute maximum and minimums? Pause it if you need to. Okay, you should have your answer now. Let's go over relative and absolute. So I'm seeing right here, right there, right there, right here. We've got some relative, absolute, maximum, minimum things going on. Those are kind of some extreme points, okay? Down here, this is going to be a minimum. This is going to be a maximum. Over here, will this be a minimum or a maximum? This will be a minimum. Okay, it's going down. Over here, it's coming up, so this is going to be a maximum. Now I just need to go through and label which ones are relative and which ones are absolute. Here, this is going to be the highest point on the graph. So that's my absolute. This is the lowest point. Over here, it's not the highest point, so this is just relative. And over here, this is also relative.